Welcome to Niagara-on-the-Lake and to historic Navy Hall, the warehouse that supplied the British garrison at Fort George, the place where the British Navy could tie up. If you stand further downriver and look out, you'll see a powerful current pushing out into Lake Ontario. In fact, when swimmers swim across Lake Ontario, they always start here because the current gives them such a kick. They're already a quarter of the way across the lake before they know it. The British Navy discovered, as all sailors who sail this river know, that there is a back eddy, that the current churning out creates a backwash which flows upriver, and it comes all the way up to Navy Hall. So if you're sailing, you don't try to sail up the middle of the river, you stop. But if you come up the side, on Niagara-on-the-Lake side, you can come up this far. Beyond here, the current is strong, and also the banks are high. So this was an ideal place for the British ships to come to offload. This is the first of many events you're going to attend this weekend, and I hope that it's enjoyable for you. We've tried to make the weather as pleasant as possible, and I think we're keeping the rain away until Monday. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Brian Purdy. Brian is a member of our organizing committee, but he's also an award-winning film and television producer with many, many years of experience with CBC and CTV and in independent film. And he's going to speak to you tonight about the two videos which you're going to see and present a cast of characters, actually, from Niagara's historic past. So Brian Purdy, please.
Thanks, Jim. Welcome, everybody. Tonight we're bringing the War of 1812 to life here at Navy Hall, the site of Canada's first provincial parliament. General Sir Isaac Brock has dropped in to share his war stories with you, so please chat him up. General Brock is portrayed by Scott Finley, and to introduce the general is Ralph Clench, a local militia officer. Mr. Clench is portrayed by Dr. Wesley Turner, co-chair of the Niagara-on-the-Lake War of 1812 Bicentennial Committee, and has authored, among other 1812 books, The Astonishing General, The Life and Legacy of Sir Isaac Brock. Mr. Clench, if you please.
It is my honor to introduce Major General Isaac Brock. He was born on the Channel Island of Guernsey to a long-established and distinguished family. At age 15, he joined the British Army as an ensign. By 1797, he was the senior lieutenant colonel of the 49th Regiment of Foot. He brought that regiment from Europe to Quebec City in 1802, and the following year, 1803, he brought it here to Fort George. Now, there was some disturbance in the regiment. Some men deserted, and others planned a mutiny. He hurried over from York, and he dealt quickly and decisively with the troubles, but also with compassion. He was concerned with the welfare of the rank-and-file soldier who lived a harsh, lonely, and dangerous life. He always tried to improve their conditions and give them some freedom within the rules of the British Army. And the men understood this, they appreciated this, and they developed a respect and affection for him. In September of 1811, he came here, now Major General Isaac Brock, as the commander of the forces of Upper Canada and the administrator of the province. So he was at the head of the military and the civil governments of this province, the very top. And he held his first parliament in February, and there were critics of the government. There was some opposition to previous governments, but they felt that General Brock was a man of integrity and honesty, and they had favorable things to say about him, such as William Firth, the Attorney General, or Dr. William Baldwin. He was also at the head of society. He brought with him a fine cellar of wine and other beverages, and a great array of food. And to be asked to dinner with General Brock was an honor and a pleasure. In February, he held a ball that was the talk of the province for the music, the gaiety, the food, the beautiful women. He was, of course, a bachelor, and although Mr. Richardson says that he was partial to dancing, and Mr. Richardson knew him quite well, he was partial to dancing and had an extreme fondness for the ladies. But his real focus was the British Army. That's what his ambition was and his focus. He was also a man of culture and learning. He brought with him an extensive library. Allow me to mention a few of the volumes in that library. Bell's edition of Shakespeare, 20 volumes. Reed's edition of Shakespeare, 12 volumes. Grammar of the French Tongue. Johnson's Dictionary, 2 volumes. The King of Prussia's Tactics. Plutarch's Lives, 6 volumes. The Siècle de Louis XIV by Voltaire, 4 volumes. The Comte de Guibert's Oeuvre Militaire, 5 volumes. And Roland's Ancient History, 12 volumes. Now, I haven't had a chance to ask him, but I'm sure, without hesitation, he would be happy to discuss any of the details of any of these volumes. It's my pleasure to welcome General Brock.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, what can we learn from that little discussion there? Don't join a Book of the Month club. Niagara, of course, the pivotal jewel here in the colonies. Originally, of course, the capital moved to York for protective reasons. But sadly, unfortunately, in close proximity to that Republican thing to the south, it really did put it in harm's way. I can only say, and I heard with this microphone business as well, as I was fond of saying, it's always important to look big and talk loud. And tonight it's necessary, obviously. I'd just like to say, though, it is indeed a jewel. Hopefully, as you're visiting here, we can only welcome you as we can do best as guests. This is not, of course, England. But we do have certain elements of it, I think, that you will find enchanting and delightful. There are a few things I would like to contest with my good friend here. In terms of an over-fondness for the ladies, I don't think that's possible. In terms of an over-fondness for beverages, definitely it's not possible. So I think one does as one can best do under the circumstances. With that thought in mind, there are plenty of amenities, of course, in the local community that will certainly see to your wine tastes, as you may have noticed with the lush growing area that is here. But of course, Niagara known more for peaches. I digress a bit because I'm certainly you probably want to hear more about war. War is a terrible thing. War is an awful thing, and the war that we face here on this frontier, particularly worse because manpower was short, and really the people that lived here, and I don't wish to call them into question, but it was necessary that we had to bolster their spirit somewhat. If you consider that many, and by many I mean probably over 50% of those that were inhabitants were former members of those United States of America, what of course would happen during an invasion we certainly did not know. So it was incredibly important to act fast, to do so with an intent, to bolster the spirit through victory. And I think you can agree that earlier on with what occurred up on Lake Huron, of course, and taking the American garrison and Michilimackinac, certainly Detroit, certainly took the wind out of their sails, and certainly closed the western gate to these provinces. These were critical elements to bolster people's spirits. If nothing else, if they could just look at that and say to themselves, well, you know what, we have a chance. We have a right and we have a chance. And once that chance, of course, was given, then it was just a question then of acting accordingly. And hopefully, of course, as well, that would be responded to by His Majesty's government as well with support. And I think you'll agree it was the best tactic we could possibly take. We were not looking for a fight. We were not looking to altercate at all with those people across the river, many of whom, by the way, had relatives on this side, relatives on that side, fathers with farms, sons out here. I even have a few of my officers who have married American ladies. The connection here was particularly tight. And I will tell you just how close it was that when just before war was declared, I do recall going to St. Mark's, of course, the Anglican church in town, and seated beside me was the surgeon from Fort Niagara who had come across with his 2 young daughters. Delightful man, and I had bumped into him a number of times over our stay here. And after the service, I was walking with them, and we walked down the road, of course, down to where their little boat was to take them back, of course, to Fort Niagara, and we were chatting. And when we got down there, I looked down, and his two charming daughters, you know, still well under the age of 10, but delightful young ladies. And I said, I have to give my 2 little rosy-cheeked Yankees a final kiss goodbye, and gave the girls a hug and a kiss. And as I said to him, and you, sir, I fear the next time we meet, we will be enemies. And even though I may have said that to him, I'm sure that was enacted up and down this river by all sorts of people that had to face the reality that what was formerly a friend and in some instances a relative now was the enemy. So we may thankfully hope that that sort of occurrence never happens once again. So, ladies and gentlemen, on that very happy note that I've left you with, may I just say, do enjoy this community, explore, ask questions, look around. There is more history per square inch, I think, in Niagara than practically any place else in this great nation. So do try and find as much of it as you possibly can. Thank you.
Thank you, General, and nice to meet you. Now I would like to highlight another War of 1812 visitor, Mr. Joseph Wilcox. He started a newspaper, the Upper Canada Guardian, and was elected to the Legislative Assembly for Lincoln and Haldimand. He fought at the Battle of Queenston Heights in October of 1812. In July 1813, Mr. Wilcox offered his services to the Americans. He was given an officer's rank. His group of traitors had the powers of arrest and searched for British sympathizers. It has been said that Wilcox was and still is Canada's arch-traitor. Joseph Wilcox is portrayed by Rick Melion. Please say hello and then duck.
Let's hear it for President Madison.
No wine and cheese for that young man, please. I'd just like to, before we keep going, a word of thanks to our 1812 reenactors joining us this evening. Nick Baxter Moore from the Glengarry Light Infantry, Marcus Schumann from the Lincoln Militia Infantry, Phil Conklin from the U.S. Infantry, Des Corn from the U.S. Marine Niagara Detachment, William Hickok from the Royal Artillery and his wife Ruth from the Lincoln Militia Infantry, Bruce Nelson from the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, John McMorland from the Royal Navy and his wife Doris. We are also graced with the personage of Laura Secord, portrayed by Kathy Thomas. So please. Please mix and match with all these people. They have lovely stories to tell and they'd be glad to chat with you. A couple of trivia items which I know you'll love to hear. 1812 was a leap year. Laura Secord was an American, born in Massachusetts. Food supplies to the British troops were smuggled across the borders of New York and Vermont. There were only 6 million people living in the U.S. in 1812, and only 500,000 living in British North America, which is now Canada. Now, I'd like you to meet Mr. William Chisholm. He fought at the Battle of Queenston Heights and went on to found the town of Oakville. Mr. Chisholm is portrayed by Tony Chisholm, who produced the Niagara on the Lake video entitled Niagara on Fire. Mr. Chisholm.
very much, Brian. Can you hear me? My involvement with this town started with my retirement, and I joined the Bicentennial Committee in 2010. So I'm not portraying William Chisholm while I'm standing up here. I'm portraying myself, who ended up by being the producer for the movie called Niagara on Fire, which you will see later. I decided to focus my efforts after joining the Bicentennial Committee on the burning of Niagara, which was on December the 10th, 1813. This was a huge event for this town 200 years ago, and no one had started to plan anything. So we formed a volunteer subcommittee and applied to the federal government for funding, but we were turned down. And so were a lot of others, actually. This forced me to go out and start a fundraising campaign. Rick and I worked on it together, and I started knocking on doors. Any contributor to the Bicentennial became a defender of the town, and we soon got huge support from the people I met, individuals, restaurants, local businesses and wineries, and eventually after 2 years we raised 75% of what we needed for the Bicentennial. And then the Ontario government donated the rest. So in all we raised $100,000 for the 2-year celebration here in town. The Burning of Niagara event became Niagara on Fire. We decided the key to the event was the 200th anniversary would be a movie, and this movie is what you're about to see. The premiere we showed on the 200th anniversary of the burning, shown on a giant screen outdoors in December. The temperature was a miserable -5 degrees, and given the weather, it could have easily been a disaster. However, it turned out to be a huge success. We showed it 5 times that evening to over 2,000 people outdoors with a sound and light show, fireworks, spotlights, and we lit up the downtown in LED stage lighting as if it were on fire. People loved it, and but it was the movie that gave them the true story of what had happened 200 years ago. We felt this was very important. In fact, we went on to show this movie to over 100 school children in upstate New York, and we produced 250 extra copies, which we gave free to all of the schools in the Niagara Peninsula. I want to stress that this movie was a joint volunteer effort. Local people came out for filming in their costumes, time after time. A volunteer working with us built the set, and then we burned it. Interpreters, another Rick here, donated his farm for the filming and the burning in the middle of winter. Remember, the burning of the town actually took place in December during a blizzard, so it was a particularly miserable event, and we wanted to make sure that that came across. So we filmed it in the middle of winter under terrible conditions. We had reenactors and interpreters from Fort George, from Fort Niagara, and Old Fort Erie. All came for nothing. All came out to be part of this movie. Another group of reenactors called the Canadian Volunteers came out 3 or 4 times for different shots. In all, it took over a year to produce. But I've talked too much. Let's watch the movie. Are you? Thank you.
"40 years have passed. I still remember it like it was yesterday. I was just a child when the Americans burned our homes to the ground. really thought that I was going to die. This really was war. It was December 1813. The flames, the smoke, the horror on my mother's face will forever remain engraved in my memory.
When Thomas Jefferson declared the acquisition of Canada would be a mere matter of marching, neither side fully understood what was about to be unleashed. War of 1812 pitched brother against brother, cousin against cousin. Niagara became the major battlefield. Land, loyalties, and alliances became the dividing lines of the day. The Canadians entered the war reluctantly, but under the brilliant command of General Isaac Brock. Early victories instilled loyalty and a growing sense of patriotism. His commitment to defend the rights of Aboriginal treaties secured the most important allies of the war. However, the death of Brock in October 1812 at the Battle of Queenston Heights was a severe blow to the British. But the strategic wisdom of Roger Sheaffe, together with the native allies under John Norton, turned a devastating loss into a significant victory. The death of Brock was tragic, and yet the Americans were repelled. It was a powerful victory. That would not be the end of it. As the year 1812 came to a close, the Americans were feeling bruised. They regrouped to form a new offensive. It seemed that all the men in town had joined the militia. That winter, they returned home, happy and eager to put away their guns. But Niagara was changing. They returned home to find that women were running the town and all its affairs. In the spring of 1813, the American Secretary of War ordered American troops to take control of the Great Lakes, to destroy the shipyards of York, and to capture Kingston and Niagara. Winter had given them time to improve their tactics. They had learned a great deal from fighting the British. Then they turned their cannons on Fort George. On May 25, 1813, the Americans unleashed a horrendous artillery barrage on Fort George, destroying virtually every wooden building within the fort and a portion of the adjacent village. 2 days later, 5,000 American soldiers invaded near 1 Mile Creek. The 1,100 British soldiers, militiamen, and natives valiantly resisted, but were eventually overwhelmed. Many lie buried where they fell on the beaches and the battlefield. General Vincent ordered the quiet evacuation of the town by his soldiers. The American occupation of the town of Niagara had begun. It was to last 7 months. 7 months that would feel like an eternity. General McClure had his own set of problems. His men were mostly sick, poorly trained, and worse, deserting. By December, as his forces dwindled, McClure knew he had little choice. He had to abandon the fort and retreat across the river. The traitor Joseph Wilcox and his band of Canadian volunteers were beside themselves. They had joined the side of the American army during the occupation, had been steadily harassing and deporting loyalists. They were in a very difficult position with the Americans abandoning the peninsula. Perhaps Wilcox convinced General McClure to give the order to burn the town on the pretext of denying shelter to the advancing British troops. He seemed determined to punish his former neighbors for their scorn. Wilcox determined they should torch the town. McClure insisted only if it was necessary. Wilcox took that as approval. The Canadian volunteers and the American soldiers set fire to the town.
Mother said some of us were only given a few minutes' warning to leave our homes. Others had a little more time, but they told us they were going to burn our town, and they did. We watched as the town burned and burned. It was so cold, and we were so frightened. And then they were gone, the Americans. Joseph Wilcox and the Canadian volunteers back across the river. There were only 2 homes left standing. We were so cold and so alone. But then the British soldiers arrived.
Militia cavalry officer William Hamilton Merritt was one of the first to arrive at the devastated scene. He said he could see by the glare at night that the town was on fire. As he advanced, he saw there was nothing but heaps of coals and streets full of furniture. Only brick chimneys were left standing. The British took revenge. They captured Fort Niagara in a daring night attack. Then they torched American villages, from Lewiston to the hamlet of Buffalo, from Lake Ontario to Lake Erie. It was a rampage of violence. Later, U.S. Brigadier General George McClure claimed he was acting under orders from the Secretary of War. His superiors disagreed. He was relieved of his command. Joseph Wilcox was killed in September 1814 during the siege of Fort Erie. The war came to an end with the Treaty of Ghent, December 1814.
No one wanted the war. We only wanted to farm our lands, run our businesses, just like the natives. They wanted the same thing, their land and peace. But everything was burned, and we all had to rebuild. And we did. We built our town, a new fort, new churches, and our legacy. And eventually, we rebuilt our relationship with our neighbors. And Niagara on the lake rose from the ashes.
In Niagara, homes were gradually rebuilt, many on the original foundations. New industries grew, shipbuilding, and later a railway breathed new life into the town. They rebuilt the town, slowly, carefully. In Niagara-on-the-Lake today, echoes of the community that was lost and rebuilt are still heard in the tree-lined streets and historic homes and gardens, our stately churches, and elegant hotels and inns that welcome visitors from around the world to share our story. The town may have burned, but nothing could douse the spirit of those early citizens.
On June 8, 2013, it was the 200th anniversary of an engagement between the U.S. and British troops in Grimsby, Ontario. A live reenactment was staged at Grimsby's historic waterfront site, which is now dedicated as Canada's first War of 1812 peace garden. Over 3,000 attended, and Ron Dale, 1812 Bicentennial Projects Manager for Parks Canada, narrated the event. The town commissioned a video entitled Engagement at the 40. It has now garnered 12 international awards. Here's Engagement at the 40.
Grimsby, Ontario is a town of 26,000 nestled between Lake Ontario and the majestic Niagara Escarpment. At the water's edge is their War of 1812 Bicentennial Peace Garden, an historical site dedicated to the American troops' retreat from the Battle of Stony Creek and the British attack at 40 Mile Creek that chased the American forces to Fort George. Today is the 200th anniversary of that famous day in history. Over 3,000 people have turned out to see British and American reenactors prepare to do battle. Welcome to the site of the action at the 40. The War of 1812 was declared by the United States against Britain on June 18, 1812, and Upper Canada, what's now Ontario, would be the major battleground. The Americans declared war on Britain because Britain was stopping American ships on the high seas to prevent them from taking supplies to Napoleon. Britain was in a world war against Napoleon, a death struggle against Napoleon, when the War of 1812 was declared. The population of the United States was 14 times that of British North America, about the same ratio as it is today. And yet, it was a combination of a professional British Army and Navy, provincial volunteers, and strong alliances with First Nations that ensured that they were able to successfully defend Upper Canada and ensure that what's now Ontario did not become another state in the Union. So with the American campaign, part of it was to capture the Niagara Peninsula and use it as a springboard for the conquest of the province. So Yeo advanced with the men of the King's Eighth, the reinforcements for Burlington Heights, but before doing so, when coming from the mouth of the Niagara River, a couple of his ships saw a lot of smoke arising from this area. The smoke was from the campfires of 4,000 Americans camped here. Well, Morgan Lewis was no stoop. He'd already had his artillery with his troops set up a gun position on the banks and start heating cannonballs up red hot. The British gunboats opened fire on the American encampment and quickly put the American cannons at a position. The American didn't surrender, though. He took off as quickly as he could, left all his tents and his equipment and supplies and so on here, and off he went back to Fort George. He left muskets here, he left food supplies, medical supplies, and so on. The British fleet then proceeds to send the reinforcements to Burlington Heights, while some of the gunboats of the British fleet were towed close to shore and started bombarding the American camp. Grimsby's slogan is friendly by nature, but 200 years ago, it wasn't so friendly. Meanwhile, the American artillery that is prepared hotshot, red hotshot, is going to try and help their comrades by firing at the British vessels. Hopefully they can put them on fire. Oh, I see that that supply party is in real trouble. They've been caught by the fellows from the British Indian Department and their First Nations allies. British infantry and sailors on board firing musketry back at the Americans, keeping them pegged down, because one cannonball hitting one of those boats, and that would be the end of that boat. Luckily, the Americans are firing high. You notice how the British have been able to land a Royal Navy landing party with some ease to outflank the Americans. And the American artillery aren't aware that they've become that close to shore. Finally, the Americans have assembled and they're driving off the British Indian Department of First Nations fellas. Meanwhile, at the far end of the field, men of the 2nd Lincoln Militia have mustered in the first time since the capture of Fort George. Now, to load these cannons, you'll notice they're one shot at a time. After each shot, the cannon has to be sponged out with a lamb's wool sponge, like a big Q-tip. So the gun barrel had to be swabbed carefully. And then the cartridge is brought up. The cartridge was the right amount of gunpowder. So the cartridge was pushed down the barrel and rammed to the bottom. The main British ships are about 2 miles offshore and they're hidden in the mist right now. But the American artillery figure if they fire at those ships, they'll prevent any more of the British Royal Navy boats from getting too close to shore and provide some protection. Oh, here come the British regulars. The muskets are slow to load. You can fire about 3 shots a minute. And if you hit someone at 100 yards, then that person you hit was indeed unlucky. Because it wasn't your skill that caused you to hit them at 100 yards, it was nothing but luck. They were terribly inaccurate. So the best way to use them was normally to mass your men together in a solid line and all fire at once. Regulars were extremely well trained, but by 1813, many of the American forces were becoming well trained as well to fight using the same tactics as the British. Well, the light infantry fight spread apart in kneeling down firing to try and keep the British from forming up properly. The American line forms to fire volleys at the British. The entire musket consisted of 3 pieces. There was a lock, stock, and barrel. The Americans are frightened stiff of the fact that they are First Nations allies with the British. So soldiers who had fought the Battle of Stony Creek only 2 days ago are exhausted. They've lost a battle at Stony Creek. They've been forced to march all the way back here from Stony Creek to stop at the 40, only to be harassed by the Royal Navy, by First Nations in the woods, trying one last desperate attack towards the British with the bayonet. Oh, a devastating volley at close range. The Americans will try to bring off their wounded. See, the Americans are using their gun limber to remove one of the wounded. He must be an important man. For every man killed outright in battle, 4 died of their wounds. Oh, it looks like the American commanders wisely decided that they've had enough for the day. Some of the local women and children come out to the battlefield because some of them will have relatives. So the reenactors are fixing their bayonets to be in parade mode, and they'll be marching past. So men of the U.S. Infantry and the Canadian Volunteers helping them out today. Men of the U.S. Artillery Regiment and sailors representing the U.S. Navy. Men representing the Royal Newfoundland Regiment of Fencible Infantry, Royal Navy Landing Party, 2nd Lincoln Militia, British Indian Department, and Haudenosaunee Allies. Thank you very much for being with us. You've been a great audience. Thank you.
Thank you. That was kind of fun because it's a live event with several cameras. We wanted to really have a relationship between the audience and the troops where you're only a few feet away, and that seemed to work quite well. The final thank yous go to the broadcast department at Niagara College, to their able crew, Mark, Brad, and Mac. Thank you very much.
The evening is yet young, but you have lots of work to do tomorrow. You were more than welcome to stay and chat for a while, but eventually the lights will go out and you will go home to bed. Be careful as you're going home. If you walk up over the fort, do not fall into one of the pits up there, because we don't have to come and find you in the morning. The streets are extremely well lit, but the fields are somewhat dark. Thank you for coming this evening. We'll look forward to seeing you all tomorrow morning. Refreshments are available from 8 o'clock, and opening ceremonies begin at 9. The birds will wake you up. They sing very loudly in this town. Good night.